In this video article, we're going to look at the only 6 things that bass beginners should practice. If you don't know who I am, I'm Paul Wolf from howtoplaybassdotcom. This is a screenshot of my Amazon author page at amazon.com. I think I've got 27 or 28 books there at the moment. Currently working on 2 more, so it'll soon be 29. My 2 most popular ones are the one you can see in the right hand corner, How to Play Bass Guitar in 50 Songs Module 1, which is a beginner's book, and this video is very much targeted at beginners. And then you can see in the center of the screen, Learning from James Jameson Volume 1. I'll do some videos talking about that book and what you can learn from that in future episodes of this series. Anyway, just a quick caveat. I want to tell you how I study and teach, because it's quite different from some people who teach out there online and in person. My teaching is based on the principles of deliberate practice, which I discovered in 2008 through a book called Talent is Overrated by Jeff Colvin. That introduced me to the work of a guy called Anders Ericsson, who's written a book called Peak, P-E-A-K. Anders sadly passed away in 2019, I think, but he was the guy who codified the principles of deliberate practice, and they apply to learning anything. I also recently discovered a concept called deliberate play, which is allied to deliberate practice. Not seen any, certainly no bass players talking about this. This is a really important concept to go into the deliberate practice toolbox. And as part of my studies, I've extensively looked at the classical music method. This is a method of teaching classical instruments like the piano, the violin, been road tested for 250 plus years. Very, very interesting learning model, not just for learning the bass, but for learning other disciplines as well. And additionally, the other string in my bow is I've analysed in detail the bass lines to somewhere in the region of 1,500 to 2,000 songs, and it's actually maybe more than that. I lost count a long time ago, and analysing the bass lines means transcribing them or getting hold of accurate transcriptions, and if I ever get a transcription from a source I don't know, I always spend some time just playing through with the transcription and the original and seeing how accurate it is. Accuracy is hugely important, and then what I do is I look for the patterns and ideas that are used in the bass lines, the rhythmic execution of those patterns, how those patterns are used to connect two chord roots together, things like that. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on in this video when I talk about devices. But so there's a unique combination there of study which infuses my teaching. Caveat before we get started, I want to share with you 2 things that if you are a bass beginner and you've maybe even started having lessons, your instructor might have started you out on, which in my opinion is wrong. It's not just my opinion, there are other teachers who agree with me. Those 2 things are scales and 4-note arpeggios. You notice I specifically wrote 4-note arpeggios because triads, which technically are an arpeggio of sort, are very defined bassline units. They're part of the foundational bassline vocabulary, but 4-note arpeggios are not. You don't often see in a bassline, say on a C7 chord, you don't often see a bass line which goes from C to E to G to B flat. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it doesn't happen often enough for you to be practicing that. Back to scales. In 1,500 bass lines, I think it's more than that, but I've gone with the lower figure for sake of argument. I've only found 7 or 8 bass lines where complete scales are used. And although a complete scale is used, so the example I use most often if someone says give me an example of a song where a complete scale is used, in Paul McCartney's bass line on Hello Goodbye, there is a descending A minor scale in the bass line. But that only happens once in each of those song sections, which is the verse. There are only 4 verses, if memory's serving me correctly there. So let's say there's 70, 80 bars in that song. Only 4 of them have a complete scale in it. So I have a practice maxim: practice how you're going to play. If you're going to play bass lines to songs, the chances that you'll be required to play scales are, I mean, you can do the maths. Let's say 1,500 bass lines. Let's say 100 bars per bass line. That's 150,000 bars. Is my maths correct? I don't know. And if let's say there's 10 songs where scales happen, and let's be generous and say 10 bars have scales, that's 100 bars of scales in 150,000 bars of bass lines. So on a percentage basis, practicing scales doesn't make much sense in terms of practicing to play bass lines in the real world. Now, I'm not saying you don't have to understand scales from a theoretical point of view, but the necessity to play scales, in my opinion, isn't there. If you disagree with me, head over to my website and you'll find on the contact page where you can contact me and email me and tell me why you disagree. I'd love to hear if you do disagree, but I don't think you should play scales. Also, one other caveat to the caveat: this assumes that you're not learning the bass from a soloing kind of perspective, i.e. you're not learning the bass to play, say, jazz and do jazz solos. The soloing language is totally different from the language that bass players use to play in rock and pop and all those genres. So unless you're doing that, and even with jazz, from what I understand, there's a great book if you're interested in jazz and jazz soloing, Elements of the Jazz Language by Jerry Coker, where he codifies 17 or 18 units of soloing vocabulary, which he thinks makes up 85-90% of the jazz soloing library. I don't recall there ever being a scale in one of those. I might be wrong. It's been many years since I've read that book, but I don't think you should be learning scales or four-note arpeggios, although I do think you need to understand the theory and learn that as you go along. Okay, so let's look at the first item that I do think you should practice, and that's the knowledge of the fretboard. There's a musical alphabet, and it lays out on your fretboard you need to learn. You need to know where C is, you need to know where D is, you need to know the different locations on different strings. It's just something that you need to know. There's good news. Level 1 of learning the fretboard can be done in a systematic way that takes just a few minutes a day of practice. And more good news, the exercises that you use for that systematic practice of learning the fretboard can be used as a warm-up before you get started on other practice items. So it makes that practice do double duty. And wherever you can make practice do double, triple, quadruple duty and make your practice time more efficient, that's a good thing to aim for. And just so you know, there are more musical levels beyond level 1, which is just learning the basic notes one by one. Practice items 2. Fretting hand technique. You need good fretting hand technique in order to play fluid lines. That means how the note is actually fretted. It should be fretted with the curl of your finger, not like a guitarist would, the flat of your hand. If you're fretting like that, you're doing it wrong. You want to be fretting like that. If you go and the reason is you get a much clearer note which you have much more control over. So it's not only how the note's fretted, you want economy of movement, you want minimal movement, and potentially you want to learn the 2 different fretting hand systems, which are double bass fretting hand, where the hand, the 4 fingers of the hand cover 3 frets on the bass, and then there's 1 finger per fret. There is extensions to 1 finger per fret, but that's not something the beginner needs to learn. More good news, another set of simple exercises will help build good fretting hand technique. And the really strange thing, counterintuitively, the slower that you play those exercises, the better your fretting hand technique will be. So these are another candidate for simple warm-up exercises that get you going, and then you move on to more dynamic practice exercises. Practice item 3 that bass beginners should have is a good, solid, foundational plucking hand technique. Now, potential problem is there are several different possibilities. You play with one finger, you can play with two fingers, you can play with four fingers, you can slap, you can tap, you can play with a plectrum. There is multiple ways of being able to pluck the bass. I think a beginner should focus on one style and get that down, and then as they move on with their bass playing journey, they can incorporate other styles. I think you should use either the two-finger rest stroke, or if you come from a guitar background and you're already comfortable with the plectrum, swap that out for playing with a plectrum. I don't play with the plectrum. It's something that I wish I'd learned when I was much younger, but the most rounded and useful technique for a beginner who's never played before is probably the two-finger rest stroke. There's lots of different things you can use it for. By different placements where your hand is on the neck, you can get different tones very easily. That's basically the foundational plucking hand technique that I teach. The fourth item that you should be practicing is mastery of quarter notes and eighth notes. Now, this isn't really taught to beginners from what I can see in a systematic way, and I think that's a poor teaching, because the bass is the glue in the band and it forms the bridge between the rhythm that's being played on the drum set and the harmony instruments. And I think bass players should understand rhythm the way that drummers do, and also they should understand harmony the way that pianists do, in order that we can execute our unique role in the band setting. And it's relatively easy to do. You can have exercises where the specific rhythm you are learning is played on a drum groove, metronomic style drum groove, where the rhythm is played on a hi-hat. And you can start out counting and clapping with your hands, and then when you're starting to get that rhythm and starting to assimilate it, you can transfer that to the bass. But perhaps, especially for beginners, start out by clapping, so that they're concentrating on one learning task, which is to learn the rhythm, before they then transfer that understanding and see how it lays out on the actual instrument as a secondary thing. Because if you try and learn the rhythm on the instrument as a beginner, that's two learning tasks you're doing at the same time, and that may be slightly beyond you at this point. It may not, and if it's not, that's great. But if it is, don't hesitate to isolate the rhythm and clap it out first with your hands, or tap it out with on a tabletop with the palm of your hand. And the great thing about that is, if you've got a set of random rhythmic exercises, that can be done in places where you don't have your bass to hand, so you can practice when you don't have your bass. So that's a really cool little side tip. Just going to take an interlude here to talk about time, and by time, which is the second part of the rhythm equation, what I mean is, so time is your internal sense of how the pulse is going, and some people have naturally good time, and that usually comes from being exposed to music at a young age. It's not anything that's inherited. Music, on the evolutionary scale of things, hasn't been around long enough for us to inherit good time from our parents if they were musicians. But if your parents are musicians, what you'll find is, as a child, you'll be surrounded by music, and time may be something that you're already quite good with because you've been listening to music from a young age, maybe clapping, etc. If you don't have good time, and some people don't have great time, it is something that can be practiced. And the sooner that bassists start working on their internal clock, the better. But in my teaching, working on time doesn't start until the beginner has grasped some other important fundamentals and is actually playing even some basic, simple ideas and lines. So that does come reasonably quickly, but not initially. Certainly not soon enough to be included in the only 6 things that bass beginners should practice. Practice item 5, I've called devices. This might be terminology you're unfamiliar with, but the bass has got its own vocabulary of ideas. These are 2, 3, and 4 note ideas, and I call them devices. And I mentioned Jerry Coker and his book of ideas for jazz soloing, elements of the jazz language. He used the term devices in there, so I've taken that term and I use it for bass devices. And I've spent, as I've said, I've spent a long time analysing and looking for these ideas, the devices, in the playing of everyone from Jameson to Paul McCartney to Jaco Pastorius to Rocco Prestia to Bruce Thomas to anyone you can think of. I've probably analysed 2 or 3 of their lines, and it's amazing how these devices appear all across all genres of music. Rock, pop, blues, funk, soul, country. All those genres use the devices. Some of them are simple, some of them are more complex, and from a teaching perspective, I've applied the 80-20 perspective to it. So I've identified about 40 devices, but the ones that I teach beginners, the first 10, are foundational ones that you can use to make reasonably interesting lines in pop, rock, funk, blues, soul, all those genres. And all the guys I just mentioned, name checked, all the bass players use these devices. So if you learn them, and these are when someone says to me, well, if I don't practice scales, what should I practice? These are the things that I advise practicing. You can practice them in all 12 keys using what I call cycle exercises, or you can practice them using common chord progressions with specific rhythms. There's several ways of practicing them. Always remembering the practice maxim, practice how you're going to play. And just as if you were learning a language, you need to learn the vocabulary. So I start with beginners with the basic vocabulary. Practice item 6. You need a sequential series of songs. And a song, song inverted commas is a bass line to a chord progression. I don't teach actual songs in the sense of I don't teach you how to play Paul McCartney's bass line on All My Loving, anything like that. But I might use the chord changes from All My Loving and put it in a simpler key and create a bass line using the foundational devices that have been taught to the student at that point in the whole progression. So that's what I call a song, and those bass lines can be designed to be that practical application of the things that the student is learning. Now, this is modelled from the classical music model, and in the classical music model, which we'll talk about more in the next video in this series, it's basically what happens is you get a series of technical exercises, theoretical exercises, and then there's a practice piece which has been composed specifically to check how you've progressed in your practice with learning whatever you're being taught. And then the practice piece also doubles as a way you can get a quick audit of your playing and identify mistakes and say, you're not quite ready to move on to the next part of the learning sequence yet, you need to practice this and this, or to go, yes, you've mastered these, so we can move on to the next part of the learning sequence and we'll start by learning this, and then you move on, and the model rolls around in that cyclical manner. A key point that I've never seen certainly any bass teachers talk, and maybe Jeff Berlin has talked about this sometimes. With Jeff's teaching, I don't agree with all of it. Some of it I agree with, and I tend to go in and out with listening or reading his stuff. So he may well have said this, and if he has, then he's the only bass player that I've seen. The key point is expert musicians, when they're learning a piece, they fix mistakes immediately. You should take that mentality now. So if you're playing something and you're playing a practice piece, let's say the practice piece is only 12 bars long and you're having trouble on bar 8, there's something in bar 8 that's causing you to make a mistake. Do not keep playing the piece expecting bar 8 to automatically fix itself. Ultimately won't, and especially when you get to be more advanced. What instead you should do is take bar 8 and isolate it, take it away from the rest of the exercise, work out what's giving you a problem, and then play it slowly. And the tempo that you should play it slowly, inverted commas, if someone says, well, how do you define slowly? it's the fastest tempo that you can play that bar perfectly without mistakes. So if you can only play it at 50 beats per minute, it doesn't matter. Play it at 50 beats per minute. And here's what you should do to fix it. This is something I didn't intend to teach, but you get a bonus piece of teaching if you've stayed with the video this far, and this applies whatever level you are throughout your music journey. So let's say you can play something at 50 beats per minute. Play it 10 times. Make sure everything's perfect. If you haven't done 5 or 10 perfect repetitions, you're not ready to move on. When you've done that, then you can move on. Maybe go up to 52 beats per minute. The brain can't really distinguish a difference between 50 and 52 beats per minute. See if you can get 5 perfect repetitions or 10 perfect repetitions at that tempo. Then do the same at 54 beats per minute and keep doing that. And the other thing you should do is not try and do, let's say you're needing to play at 80 beats per minute and it's going to take several of these cycles to get to that point. Don't try and get them all done in one practice session, because from a neurological perspective, what you're doing is creating a circuit in your brain and rewiring your brain. So if you do, say, 50, 52, and 54, and then call it a day for that exercise that day, and then practice other things, and then come back the next day, by the next day, the brain's had some time to do the rewiring. So then you start at either 52 or 54, do your 5 perfect repetitions, then do them at 56, then do them at 58, then call it a day on that exercise and move on to other things. There are always other things to be learning. And then what's happening is, if you're doing perfect repetitions, as the brain's rewiring, the perfect repetitions do a thing where they encase the new circuit that you've created in a substance called myelin, which makes it more efficient for you. Come back the third day, start at 56, 56, 58, and 60. And if you keep doing that and keep going back one tempo to make sure that your warm-up or your first repetition is perfect, over time what will happen is you'll correct the mistake and you'll be able to play that thing. And it doesn't matter if it takes a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks even, or even longer. But that's how you fix mistakes. And immediately you identify one, the important thing is to go, whoa, I need to stop and I need to fix that mistake, and spend time fixing it. If you don't, you'll get to a point where suddenly you're playing something and the only way you'll be able to get through a piece is to either simplify what you're playing in that particular bar, which, if you're a working musician, is the quick fix you should use. If you're playing a gig on Saturday and you've got to play something and you can't play it. So that's one way to get around it. Or you're going to have to stop then and relearn what you've been trying to learn and just flobbing. So do take that on board. That is an advanced piece of advice that applies across the board from beginners to advanced players. More on practice item 6. The chances are that you're taking up the bass because you want to play with your friends or you want to play in a band. So you don't, although there are some people who do this, it's unlikely or less likely that you just want to play a noodle in your bedroom along with your favourite songs. But there are some people who take up the bass to do that. But the best part of playing the bass is playing in a band. It's and if you I once sent out an email which got a decent amount of flack. The headline was something like, "Playing great music in a great band with a great audience is the best high you can get that's legal." It was something like that. It was 10 years ago. I don't remember the headline, but it's absolutely true. So if you are starting out, do look to try and play with other people in front of an audience. It's a fabulous experience. So I would advise you to have that aim. The reason I mentioned it is the sooner that you start playing song-like bass lines as part of your learning progression, the better, because that means that when you do come and you go, right, my friend wants me to play in his band, the idea of learning parts to play in a song will not be alien to you. So again, it comes back to that maxim: practice how you're going to play. And I just wanted to say that sequential, in the terminology that I used on the previous slide, it means that the song should get progressively harder. So to go from song 1 to song 2 requires you to learn new skills, new things, and practice those new skills to make the jump from song 1 to song 2. By doing that and having those series of songs, they serve as steps that will take you from picking up the bass for the first time to a reasonable level, and you can go as far as you want to go with this methodology. The only thing that you need to put into it is someone teaching it and putting in the right practice. Okay, to close out, the next video article, I'm going to show you a practical example of how these concepts can be applied and how they come together, and they model the classical music learning method, and I'll use song 1 from my 50 song series as an example, and there will be actual video examples of me playing and some music examples written out, which will be within the article too. This is very much setting up that article and the articles that follow it. And everything is all connected to my series of songs. The first one is called How to Play Bass Guitar in 50 Songs Module 1. You can find this on your local Amazon store. If you purchase it new and send a copy of your invoice to me, I'll add you to the accompanying online web version totally for free. And that has all the musical examples played, plus there's MP3s to download, and there's some bonus lessons as well. So go to Amazon, How to Play Bass in 50 Songs Module 1, check that out. At the moment it's on I'm terrible with dates, so it's Thursday the 14th of August. At the moment I've dropped the price to $19.99. At some stage in the next week or so, it will probably go back up to just shy of $25. So now is a good time to grab it. So do that. Thank you for your time watching this video article, and I'll catch you in the next one where we focus on the topics that we've discussed today in a much more practical manner.